Thank you for joining me again in this walk through the Passion Week. We started on Palm Sunday and we will end on Easter Sunday, walking with Jesus through every day of that week as he shows the full extent of the love of God. Last night we participated in the Last Supper, that very meaningful centerpiece of the Christian faith, where we celebrate this meal, as we talked about last night, this meal that signifies this great covenant that God made for us, not between us, not with us, but for us, that one-way covenant that God gave his best. And that best is the person and the work of Jesus Christ, particularly on the cross, as he gives us his all. And we celebrate that with a meal called the Last Supper. Today we make a somber journey through the crucifixion of Jesus. So let me walk with you through the timeline. On Thursday afternoon, Jesus was preparing with the disciples for Passover, that meal that celebrated the deliverance of the Jews from Egypt. Jesus at the Last Supper would turn that around and say, this is now the celebration of me delivering the world from sin, from darkness, from shame, from a separation from God, and he would give us forgiveness. He would give us salvation for free. So they were preparing for that Passover meal around 3 o'clock. Around 6 o'clock, they would gather in that upper room where Jesus washed the disciples' feet in this incredible act of humility and kindness, taking the form of a servant, the least of the servants, to wash his disciples' feet. By 6:30, Jesus was revealed as the betrayer, the one who would sell Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, and Judas leaves to do what Jesus says he must. By 7 p.m., the Passover meal begins. This is the Lord's Supper, as he says, this bread is a symbol of my broken body given for you. This cup, this wine, is a symbol of my shed blood given for you. By 8 p.m. that night, Jesus is giving his final sermon. It is this discourse to his disciples, leaving them a new culture, a culture of love, of grace, of servanthood, of being brothers of one another, and even friends of God. By 9 p.m., Jesus prays for his disciples. They're now back at the camp, the Mount of Olives, where they stayed every night that week. And at the camp, Jesus begins to struggle. He begins to suffer. He begins to feel the weight of what is about to happen on the cross. Not just the physical pain, but bearing the sins of the world upon himself, paying for them all. And so he prays to his Father, and he pleads with him, God, if there's any other way to take this cup of suffering from me, take it away from me. I don't want to do this. He doesn't want to bear the sins of the world. He doesn't want to go to the cross. He's fully human, yet he's fully divine. So sweating drops of blood, he says to his Father, not my will, but yours be done. And he submitted himself for his mission. So around midnight, that's when roughly 600 soldiers and temple guards come to arrest Jesus. John 18:7 says, Jesus asked the soldiers, what is it you want? They said, we want Jesus of Nazareth. He says, I am he. Peter rises to attack the guards. That's just kind of his way, but Jesus stops him and says, this is not a kingdom of swords. Put away your sword. I shall not drink the cup the Father has given me. He says, I am going to drink this cup. I'm going to take in this suffering, and you shall not confront that with swords. There's a lot of controversy about who is responsible for the death of Jesus. Some say it was the Jews that put Jesus to death. That has a lot of racist history around that. Some say it was the Romans that put him to death, that they were the ones that actually ordered the crucifixion. Some say it was sinful man that put Jesus to the cross, that we all nailed Jesus to the cross because of our sin against God. But John 18:11, Jesus says very clearly, put away your sword. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? God the Father pushed his Son forward to suffer. That was his mission. And we could have a lot of sort of emotional response about that. Why would the Heavenly Father push forward his only Son to suffer? Well, here's the answer in Romans chapter 5. But God demonstrates his own love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. When we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son. It took the death of the Son of God to break through every barrier between God and man, to break through the barrier of sin, to break through the barrier of religion, to break through this barrier that somehow we can attain God's blessing through our own goodness, through our own morality, through our own religion. It cost Jesus his life to push through that. Now, the closest parallel I can think of in earthly terms would be when a mother and a father send their son off to war. When a son steps up and says, I want to step forward to defend my country, or when a daughter steps forward to say to her mother and father, I will step forward to defend my country, a parent might feel a certain way about that. A parent might feel a certain grief, a certain almost remorse, even a certain regret But really, when the mission is understood, that it's going to take sacrifice to save others, the parent says, yes, okay, go forward. And there will be tears and there will be heartbreak, but go forward. We know what you have to do. That's the heart of the Heavenly Father. He loves His only begotten Son, but He also loves us, His adopted daughters, His adopted sons, and He knew that only by sending His Son, as the metaphor goes, off to war to confront the evil of the world, to confront the sin of the world, and to take on the evil of the world and take on the sin of the world, only when the Father sends His Son into the suffering, into the fight, are we saved. John 18:12 goes on. Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound Him and brought Him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. So Caiaphas is the high priest who earlier in John 11 declared, it is better that one man die for the people than a whole nation to die. And that is the sign that Caiaphas was willing to put Jesus to death in order to, quote, save the people. What he didn't know is that it took the death of Jesus to save the people. So he was speaking truth, but not in the way he was thinking. He was saying Jesus has to die to get him out of the way so that the Jews can be saved, when it was in fact Jesus that had to die in order to save the world, to forgive the world, to bring the love of God to the world. It's at this moment that Judas betrays Jesus with a kiss. And this is, of course, the great irony that the one who was most close to Jesus, one of the disciples of Jesus, ended up being the one who betrayed Jesus with the closeness of a kiss. So it was between 1 a.m. and 6 a.m. on that early Friday morning that Jesus is subjected to 6 illegal trials. Keep in mind, they are scrambling to try to put Jesus to death. The Jews don't have the unilateral authority to do that. They had to get Roman permission. And so Jesus was bounced back and forth between Jewish courts, religious courts, and Roman courts, and political courts. And so finally they wake up the Roman governor, and this is Pontius Pilate, and they say, hey, listen, we want to put Jesus, a Jew, to death. And Pilate was annoyed by this. He was always annoyed by the Jews because in the Roman mind, they were an annoying people, and they just needed to be subjugated, and they needed to be sort of, put to rest and put at peace. And so when they get riled up, Pilate is very aggravated. And so in John 18:33 it says, Pilate went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, are you king of the Jews? Now Pilate is trying to just get rid of this whole scene. He doesn't want to crucify somebody the religious leaders bring to him. They only want to crucify people for treason against Rome. And so when religious leaders say, hey, we want to kill Jesus for a religious cause, they're totally annoyed by that. He doesn't want to do that. And so he asks a simple question. And he was hoping for a simple answer. Are you king of the Jews? And Jesus was expected to say, of course I'm not the king of the Jews. And Pilate would have let him go. He wanted to let him go. But listen to what Jesus says. He's very precise. And this is very true, of course, to the syllable. Jesus said to Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would go fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews. But now my kingdom is from another place. So Pilate's kind of confused. Are you king of the Jews? Jesus didn't say yes or no, but he says, I'm a king of a kingdom. So Pilate presses him. Are you a king then? Because he's trying to let Jesus go. Are you a king then? Jesus answered, you are right in saying I am a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this reason I came into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. Jesus says, I am the king of the truth. I'm not the king of the Jews. I'm not the king of Rome. I'm the king of the truth, and my kingdom is a kingdom of truth, a kingdom built on love and grace and service and forgiveness, all the things Jesus stood for and taught. So Pilate's in a tough spot now. You could say he's almost in an impossible position. He is responsible for keeping the peace. The city is in an uproar because the religious leaders got the city in an uproar demanding the death of Jesus. And so he's got to keep the peace. So in one sense, he's pressured to crucify Jesus because if he does, he's thinking that the city would be more at peace, the religious leaders would be at bay, and things would be fine. Yet he doesn't want to do something unjust. He doesn't want to kill Jesus, who is no real threat to Rome. And Pilate knew that. I mean, Jesus came riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. That's a burden of a beast of burden, a beast of selflessness, a beast of humility. And Jesus never carried a sword. He never threatened war. So he's in a tough spot. And so Pilate asked Jesus, what is truth? With this, he went out again to the Jews and said, I find no basis for a charge against me. And he says, listen, even though Jesus says I'm a king of a kingdom, this invisible kingdom, He's no threat. So he says to the Jews, I'm not going to crucify him. I find no charge against him. And so he pulls out an old trick. Because the Passover feast was about freeing the Jews from slavery, and Rome had the Jews in slavery essentially, during the Passover the Romans would give them sort of an olive branch of peace, and to say, okay, during Passover we're going to let one person free, and you choose. So it's kind of a way to say, okay, Jews, you celebrate freedom, fine. We're going to give you one person to be free. And it's either going to be Barabbas, one of the worst criminals in the city, or Jesus, who never lifted a finger to harm anybody. And they shouted, give us Barabbas. Now Barabbas had taken part in a rebellion, so Rome didn't want Barabbas free. He was a traitor against Rome. But they thought, okay, certainly this most vile criminal is not going to be the one the Jews scream to be set free, but that's exactly what happened. So Pilate pulled out another trick. He still didn't want to crucify Jesus, and so he had him tortured. He had him flogged. Now, this is a brutal and cruel torment. It says in John 19 that Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went to him again and again, saying, Hail, King of the Jews. So they're mocking him for being this, quote, king. They struck him in the face with their fists. They pulled out his beard. And then they came to him again once more and said to the Jews, Look, I'm bringing him out to you, and to know I find no basis of charge against him. Here is Jesus, beaten almost to a pulp, beard ripped out of his face, beaten with sticks in this crown of thorns. His back is shredded to nothing by this flogging with a cat of nine tails, 9 strips of leather, each with rock or glass tied to the end. No flesh on his back, beaten and bruised. And Pilate is saying, enough, you have your blood. I've tortured this man. Let him go. And what did the crowd do? They shouted, crucify him, early on that Friday morning. And so Pilate, having no other option, sends him away to be crucified. And as they do, they began to beat him mercilessly on the journey to the cross. They mocked him incessantly. They placed his crown of thorn on his skull and beat it into his head with sticks. They made him carry his own cross. The crossbeam of the cross was put upon his shoulders and upon his back, which had no skin left on it. And he carried that to the place of Golgotha, the place called the skull. And as he's walking, crowds are lining the walkway, some mocking him, others hailing him and worshiping him. When he gets to the place of the skull, where they would crucify people on a high knoll outside the city of Jerusalem, they stripped him of his clothes. They stretched out his hands, and they nailed his wrists to a cross. They stretched out his legs and nailed his heels to the cross. And at 9 a.m., they lifted that cross high on the tallest hill for the whole city to see. At 9 a.m., the cross was plunged into the hole and wedged there. At 9 a.m., he was left there to die, experiencing the utter horror and the utter humiliation of the cross. Jesus, the Son of God, the perfect light of heaven, descended into the darkest recesses of evil. Jesus was swallowed by the worst depravity ever conceived in the heart of humankind. The fullness of divinity submitted himself to be condemned by his own creation. Because he loves us all so much, because the sins of the world had to be borne by the perfect Son of God, the greatest gift given so that we would know the full extent of his love, he submitted himself to betrayal. He submitted himself to arrest. He submitted himself to 6 trials. He submitted himself to beatings, to flogging, to humiliation, to the mockery of the crowd, to injustice, being treated as a common criminal. He submitted himself to condemnation, submitted himself to torture, committed himself to carry his own cross to the place of his crucifixion. And there, with his wrist nailed, and there, with his heels nailed, he was lifted on high in humiliation and torment for the world to see. At 9 a.m., Jesus was crucified. I'll see you back here at 3 p.m. because he was on the cross for 6 hours. And for those of you who are fasting during this time, if you started last night, you're fasting, those hunger pains are coming a little bit. And it's just that subtle reminder of the depth of the suffering of Jesus, the depth of the price that he paid to forgive you, to forgive me, and to forgive the sins of the world. So I'll see you back here at 3 p.m.